Politically speaking, we're in the grip of a rather massive reactionary thrust to the progress, probably, of the last 150 years. And that is a natural part of political life. There are actions and reactions. Reaction coming out of conservative orientation and ideology, and progress coming out of a progressive kind of ideology. I want to refer particularly to this book. This is Albert O. Hirschman's The Rhetoric of Reaction, and he says here, perversity, futility, and jeopardy. The three main arguments that are made by reactionaries to progress. Now, there have in the last 250 years, 300 years, been three main progressive thrusts in American society anyway, and probably British as well, and Western Europe. The first is really the one that eventually led to the outlawing of slavery, and it was about the equality of people before the law, before the Constitution of the country. We in America fought a civil war over that, but the English actually fought it out in their parliament and didn't, well, they did, some of them came to blows, most of them did not. But the first one was the idea of equality before the law. The second major thrust, political thrust of progressive life, has been the addition of suffrage. First, it was only landed men who had suffrage, white men, and in the United States, and that was gradually expanded to after the Civil War to black men as well, and then in the 1920s women were given the suffrage as well. They in many ways took it rather than were given it. They worked ardently for it. But the second major progressive trend was toward universal suffrage. The third area of political progressiveness was the development of the welfare state. And we're still very much in the flux of the reaction to that. In the last, we're particularly in a reactionary phase right now. Some of it is reaction to cultural issues like abortion, but others, the main ones, are often about having a welfare state. We don't have universal health care in the United States. We still don't. Pretty much every Western country except ours and in Japan and other places have universal coverage, which is about half as expensive as ours and covers pretty much everybody. Now, it's not perfect, but it is a part of universal coverage. Even the Tories don't seem to be able to get rid of the National Health Service in Britain, because it is popular enough with the political. So that, for them, that progress has been made. But here in the United States, it has not been made. We have this patchwork of healthcare insurances that are inadequate. But those are not the only inadequate parts of the welfare system. Certainly, most states are having problem with foster care issues. Most states have funding problems for health care for the poor. There are all kinds of things that are going on in the welfare state that are not progressing. Now, the arguments that are used, there are three main arguments that conservatives use. And in this case, I would say not conservatives so much as reactionaries. And Hirschman characterizes those as perversity, futility, and jeopardy. Now, perversity means that no matter what you pass policy-wise, the good that you want to do with that policy is not going to happen. You listen to somebody who's perfectly rational, like David Brooks, and he argues out of really a position that would have been taken by somebody like Edmund Burke, that says basically most of the policies of the government don't work. So perversity is probably, and he doesn't even try to make the argument, he just says, we all know that policy doesn't work. Not true, of course. We do have Social Security, which works pretty well for people who need retirement income. Some people, that's all they have. But that was a policy of the 1930s that is still going and is popular enough that even the conservatives can't get rid of it, though they've tried numerous times and will try again, I'm sure. But the argument they use is, look, policy is not important because it doesn't work anyway. We're to the point now where they don't even make the perversity argument. They simply say all policy is worthless. And so the Republicans refuse to govern because policy doesn't work, except when they need it for markets or something like that. The second argument is about futility, which is basically just taking that idea of perversity and realizing basically, and that's the David Brooks idea, that no government policy works. That's futile. Whatever good we might think we're doing with it, it's not going to happen. Well, I'm not sure that that's true. For instance, we're going through the miseries of the guns in our country, the way too many guns, a policy which is basically run by the manufacturers of arms, who have funded lavishly the NRA, and they've managed to quadruple the number of firearms in the country since 1970. And we had a lot of them in 1972. But the idea behind futility is that you can't really solve any problem anyway. That policy decisions don't work, which is ultimately saying that basically the rule of law doesn't work because, you try to do something and unintended consequences destroy it or make it futile. The third idea is jeopardy, the idea that if you make this progressive move with this particular thing, you will destroy something else. Let me show you. This is not a reactionary thing, but it is, if you will, the progressives are reactionary about Roe v. Wade. And the thing is, if Roe v. Wade is abrogated, which it likely will be, then it goes back to the states. And some states will close it off completely, and other states will provide abortion services. And then we'll have to sort out all of the messiness about the abortion pill and all of those other things. Of course, banning abortion is a minority position, at least in terms of polling. And we are in the throes of minority government, but we'll go there in a minute. But jeopardy basically says if this policy happens, then something else will be destroyed. So if the Supreme Court decides to get rid of abortion because they say the rights of women are not explicitly stated in the Constitution, then from a progressive point of view, what's to stop the court from going against LGBTQ plus rights as a progression? So some people say, well, they're working against what the Supreme Court seems to be headed for, which is getting rid of Roe v. Wade at this moment in 2022. We'll see. Maybe cooler heads will prevail, although I doubt it. Nevertheless, the idea of jeopardy is if you do this one thing, then something else that you have had that has been progressed in the proper direction before will be destroyed. Now, it's not quite the same argument as a reactionary would make, but it is similar. If you consider the Roe v. Wade as the sort of settled position, the mainstream position, then the normally progressive people who want it to stay, medically safe abortion to remain, their arguments would be, whoa, if they actually make this choice based on what they see as phantom rights, which is absurd. It's absurd for a number of reasons. All you have to do is read the 14th Amendment to realize you cannot enslave people's wombs. It's just, it's slavery. Whether you like it or not, that's what it is. But you can argue that. So these are the three arguments that conservatives, that reactionaries make against the progressive experiences: equality, universal suffrage, and the welfare state being the sort of historic progressive issues of the last 250, 300 years. And perversity means you try something and it doesn't work very well, or it has unintended consequences that you don't like. Futility is that there's not really anything you can do about it. Society is what it is, and it's a mess. Well, okay, that's an argument, but it's not a very good one. And then finally, the idea of jeopardy, which is that progress in this particular way will cause destruction of already gains in the progressive area. Okay, the reason I bring this up is because politically speaking, we are in a reactionary phase, and we like to say the pendulum swings back and forth, which makes it sound very sort of regularistic, but it isn't. It took the unions from the mid to late 19th century till the mid 20th century to gain enough power to get decent the progress of having workplace inspection, OSHA, that kind of thing. The regulations of the union idea has been meant to help the worker have a better life and one that's protected. A number of safeguards have been added, like, watching over pensions. The pension law from the Lyndon Johnson era back in the 1960s did something to shore up the government inspection of these things. And while we still hear about companies that deplete pension funds that they have control over, it's less of a problem than it used to be. Now, that doesn't mean that they haven't underfunded their pension problems, and corporations have busily tried to switch us away from the kind of liberal pension reforms of the 1940s and 50s, but policy is there as an aid as well. Regulation is not just about causing corporations trouble, it's also about keeping corporations accountable for their responsibilities. In the mid-20th century, corporations, because of their participation in World War II and their workers' participation, were much less responsive to their stockholders and much more responsive to their workforce. In the 1970s, they began to walk away from that, and now most corporations could care less about their workers in terms of whether they come or go, whether they're hanging on to them or not. Of course, they have programs for trying to hang on to them, but those programs really don't really help very much, because they're generated by the leadership of the corporation and not by the negotiation of the workers with the corporations. Although it appears that the latest generation of upcoming Americans are prone to like unions, and so we'll see. We think of it as a pendulum, but it's not. It's dependent on the courage of people. The courage of corporations in the 1970s to take away the hard-won rights of unions, which they did a superb job of destroying much of what unions had wrought. The superb job that unions did over the previous 100 years to try to get the kinds of things they wanted. Those progressive things were going on, and they were concerned mostly about this third phase, the welfare. Universal suffrage, while mostly achieved, has been, after all, abrogated by voter suppression laws by mostly Republicans, because they're a distinct minority and they're trying to hang on to power by gerrymandering and by now, admittedly, when the Democrats owned the Congress, which they did from probably World War II mostly till the 1980s, they gerrymandered their little hearts away to secure safe seats for their community. But it's not quite the same process that it was. There are attempts to try to deal with those. But the arguments all fall into these, the reactionary arguments of perversity, futility, and jeopardy. Anyway, I recommend this book highly. I think every freshman in any college program should read this. Now, you could be like David Brooks and other conservatives, Ross Douthat and others who have read the original Edmund Burke and just thought he was great. Edmund Burke was he was prescient. He, after all, lived at the time of the French Revolution, and he saw the direction that he thought it would go, which was into a disastrous sort of Madame Defarge guillotining anybody they didn't like, to the creation of a dictatorship. But, Edmund Burke's long gone, and the French Republic is still here, and it's gone through a number of iterations since then. So, his early observations of the French Revolution really don't apply anymore, realistically, to what's happened to France in the last 150 years. Not that France is a perfect republic, but it has a lot to recommend it as a Western society, and it certainly has some of the best health care arrangements for its population of any industrialized country. Now, that doesn't mean they haven't gone through reactionary and progressive. They have a rather large reactionary group, but that group will never be a majority unless the progressives shoot themselves, as they tend to do, in the foot. So, William O. Hirschman, the Rhetoric of Reaction, is a nice little historical look at the progress of democracy in the last 200 years in the West, and he delves into the largely reactionary arguments against the progress that has happened, and pretty much shoots them down. Nothing wrong with incremental change, but it's not very human. Anyway, so there it is. William O. Hirschman. Read him. He's great. His books are great.